missing from this year's event, instead submitting taped addresses. Also missing is the man who represented Israel for the 5 previous years, the former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danon, and he's back in Israel. He joins us now from Ra'anana. And Mr. Ambassador, thanks for joining us again on I-24 News. Let me ask you, I've been to the UN General Assembly, and there, of course, is much action in the hallways, in the side meeting rooms, as there is, of course, in the main General Assembly Hall. So how much of a, let's say, a loss for world diplomacy, maybe even for Israel, that this year that all that action is missing and it's really just taped addresses?
Well, as you mentioned, it is unfortunate to watch what's happening today at the UN. You do not have the excitement, the energy. Usually you open the General Assembly with speeches of President of Brazil, President of the US, the hosting country. It is not the case today. You have video recorded messages. You don't have the energy in the room, and you don't have any side events, side meetings. And the beauty of the UN that in the same building, you can walk in the corridor and meet the head of state and have a conversation with them. I recall that when President Trump first came to the UN after he got elected, I actually met him in the corridor, and I spoke with him, and I thanked him for his speech. And we spoke about his meeting with the prime minister the next day, and you see that a lot. So it's not happening today, and you don't have any bilateral meetings between the head of states. It is unfortunate because we were able to achieve a lot. And today we actually see the fruit of the meetings that we had during the General Assembly. Sometimes we did it quietly with Muslim leaders. We took advantage of the fact that we are in New York City with so many leaders.
Right. Interesting to hear from an Israeli official that how Israel benefited from being there at the UN General Assembly. Now, we did hear taped addresses of 2 leaders today, President Trump and President Rouhani of Iran. President Trump making just a brief comment about Iran, a critical comment, but he did praise the peace treaties for Israel, between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, and President Rouhani attacking those. So I just want to get your response about who do you think got the better of that exchange there at the UN on that subject of Israel between Trump and Rouhani?
So first, we have to acknowledge it is not the level of argument that we are used to. Even when you look at the speech of President Trump, it was a very short speech. He spoke for 7 minutes. Usually he speaks for half an hour when he comes to the UN. So it wasn't the same energy. That's what happened when you have it in a video message and not live in front of the ambassadors and head of states. But we should listen very carefully to President Trump's words about Iran, about China. For sure, he put a lot of pressure on China in his speech. And I think the Iranians continuing with their lives. They are trying to play the game. And I think it is important, especially today, when the U.S. is trying to push more sanctions, that people will see the difference between the lies of the Iranians and the determination of President Trump.
Right. Now, there was another leader besides President Rouhani critical of Israel, maybe even who was more critical of Israel than the Iranian leader, and that is the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. I want to let's listen to a brief snippet of President Erdogan's speech.
Participation of some countries of the region in this game does not mean anything beyond serving Israel's efforts to erode basic international parameters. Countries that have declared their intention to open embassies in Jerusalem in violation of the United Nations resolutions and international law only serve to make the conflict more complicated with their actions.
Dana, your successor there at the United Nations, Ambassador Gilad Erdogan, who was actually in the hall, got up and walked out at the General Assembly Hall during those comments and several more by President Erdogan. I want to ask you, is that what you would have done if you would have been in the hall? And also the bigger question of how Israel should contend with President Erdogan, who really is emerging as in some ways, maybe not militarily, but certainly diplomatically as its primary antagonist in the region.
So you can actually feel the frustration coming from Mr. Erdogan. He was trying to incite the Muslim world against Israel. He did it in the last 5 years, claiming that we are taking over the Temple Mount, spreading lies about our boys and girls in the IDF, and it's not working for him. On the contrary, we are signing peace agreements with Muslim countries. We are hopefully opening embassies in more countries in the Gulf. So you can feel the frustration, and he will continue to incite. But I think what he felt today, that he has no one who actually buys his lies. So he's isolated. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to continue to isolate Erdogan and to reveal his face of evil and incitement.
Right. Now, I would like to actually move away from the UN for a moment to look elsewhere here in the region, because there are a couple of events of relevance involving Hezbollah and Lebanon. We saw, of course, the other day, this verdict delivered in the Burgos bombing in Bulgaria, finding guilty Hezbollah operatives of carrying out a terrorist attack against Israelis on Bulgarian soil. Today, we see another explosion in Lebanon, this time reportedly been at a Hezbollah weapons cache in South Lebanon. Now, all this is happening when the international community is negotiating with the Lebanese government over aid to that country following that Beirut blast. I want to ask you what should be Israel's message to the international community about how to deal with Hezbollah, the role of Hezbollah in the Lebanese government as it's negotiating aid to that country?
So there are two parts for that. First of all, we have to demand that all countries will actually acknowledge what Hezbollah is. Hezbollah is the terrorist organization, period. Sometimes we feel that in the UN, in other international bodies, people are not willing to recognize it. They would call it a terrorist organization, a radical movement. They will not even name Hezbollah by name. Even when we speak about what happened in Bulgaria, they are not acknowledging that those was a Hezbollah cell. I want to thank Germany that actually accepted our approach and labeled Hezbollah the terrorist organization and banned its activities completely in Germany. That is the way to approach Hezbollah. The second part regarding the Lebanese government, yes, they should help the Lebanese government and the Lebanese people, but they have to make sure that the funds and the weapons are not going to the hands of Hezbollah. We have seen it in the past that some countries are actually giving funds and weapons to the Lebanese military, the Lebanese army, and at the end of the day, Hezbollah is taking over that. So we tell our colleagues in Washington and in the European capitals, yes, you should support the Lebanese people, but make sure you are not supporting a terrorist organization.
Right. I just want to ask you on a personal level, you're back in Israel, you spent some productive years at the UN. During a week, the General Assembly leak, I mean, do you miss being a part of that action?
Actually not. You know, it's nice to look at it from the side after 5 General Assemblies, but this time it's different. Usually it is a big headache to coordinate the visit of the Prime Minister, to coordinate bilateral meetings with dozens of head of states. Now when you don't have the head of state in the city, the General Assembly is much more relaxed.
All right, so Ambassador Gilad Erdan has a somewhat easier task of it this week than you did when you were there years at the United Nations, former ambassador of the UN. Danny Danon, thank you for joining us again on I-24
Thank you very much.
News.